What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you know before the start of this video that this is the Sunday compilation video. What that means is that this video is a compilation of all the other stories I've read so far this week, just in case you missed them or you didn't have time or whatever it may be. They're in the form of a longer video, so if you want to listen to it in the background or while you go to sleep or something, you can do that easily. There's a whole playlist of them in the description. All the ads in this video will be after the first 2 or 3 stories, and then after that in the video, there will be no more ads. So I hope you guys enjoy the video, and thank you guys so much for watching. I used to work in a clothing store in the mall. Very often, I was the last person leaving. I would close up the store, make sure everything was clean, and then lock up and leave. The mall was usually very busy. It was a Mills outlet mall, but I don't really want to mention where exactly it was. Eventually, a day came when we were having a bit of a violent winter storm. It wasn't so bad when I'd left for work that day. However, once I got there, the snow was falling in full force. I could barely even see where I was going when I got out of the car and tried to make it into the mall. I had to shield my eyes because the snowflakes were getting into them, and they actually hurt quite a bit. I had no doubt in my mind this day was not going to be very busy at the mall. I was right. The huge mall was totally dead for almost the entire day. A lot of the stores actually made the decision to close up early. I was the only one working my store at the time, so the manager of the store called me up and left it up to me whether or not I wanted to work that day. I decided I really needed the hours, customers or not. I kept the store open a few hours before closing anyway, since nobody was coming in at all. The mall became a bit of a ghost town. So many stores were closed up, their gates pulled down already, and all the lights off as well. Only a few people remained in the entire place. I guess the pretzel store and the food court had remained open because a guy who was working there came into my store. I didn't really get a good feeling from him right away. He didn't really seem to be interested in the clothes. He would shuffle through a few shirts, then keep looking at me. Eventually, he made his way over to the counter and tried to make some small talk with me. I didn't really like talking to him. Something about him felt off and very forced. After a while, he asked me a very weird and cliché question. Hey, you ever see a dead body? That was strange. I told him no, as I'd never been to a funeral before. He nodded and said, "It's really cool. I mean, a dead body looks so different than the person looked when they were alive. It's like when someone dies, something leaves them, something that made them who they are. You should really see one sometime." I don't think I have to explain that this made me very uneasy. It was a sick and weird thing to just say out of nowhere. He kept talking about dead bodies too. The guy spent a good 30 minutes talking about it before he suddenly left to go back to his restaurant. Before I could even sigh in relief, however, he came back and continued to speak to me about dead bodies and decaying things. As before, I couldn't really believe he was just talking only about this. I really wished in that moment that I had agreed to close the store early. When a closing came, the only thing I really had to do was close the gate and make sure all the drawers were locked up and safe. I decided to hurry out the back door to prevent myself from running into that creepy guy again. The snow was still coming down hard at this point. It had piled up quite a bit too. Fortunately, however, the mall parking lot had been plowed, likely several times throughout this all. All I had to do was wipe the snow off my car. Then I could go home. As I was wiping off the excess ice and snow, though, I saw a figure walking towards me in the falling snow. I wasn't sure who it was, because there was almost no visibility. I was just finishing the back window of my car. I walked over and opened up my car door. I felt the warm air of the heater because I had been letting the car warm up in the meantime. I turned around and saw that figure just standing there, staring at me in the snow. I still couldn't make out who it was, just that there was somebody there. Then though, through the falling snow, I heard a familiar voice calling to me. You know, I really want to see a dead body. I wonder how different you'll look after you died. I didn't respond. I also didn't waste any time. I jumped into my car, slammed the door, skipped the seatbelt, and took off. I did not look back. I didn't care that my car skidded on the snowy road several times. I just got the car back in place and took off because I wanted to get as far away from this person as possible. The next day, I told my boss about what happened. We talked to the manager of the pretzel place, and he told us the guy had quit that very same morning. I guess I wouldn't be seeing him again. I really haven't seen him since then, but I often expect to every time I'm in that parking lot alone. I live in a third-story apartment all by myself. I actually chose this apartment because it had a nice balcony with a sliding glass window that faced the other side of the building. This was cool because the sun never shined in my apartment. I liked it all dark and cozy. I kept my grill out there because once a year I would do a barbecue. The only bad thing about that balcony was that in the winter it would pile up with snow. And of course, this is an apartment. Because I hated mowing grass and I hated shoveling snow, I did not want to shovel all that snow off the balcony. I just kinda left it there until it melted usually. I kept the blinds on the sliding glass door closed throughout the winter. The day this happened, I was coming home from work. We'd had pretty bad snowfall over the past few days. It was snowing particularly hard as I came home that day. I was really tired from staying vigilant all the way home. I just wanted to jump on the couch and sleep forever. As I was sitting down on the couch though, I heard this really odd scratching noise. I'm not even sure how I would describe it to you. I guess it was like a rubbing sound, like if you took your thumb and pressed it up against a window really hard and scratched your nail on it. You know what I mean. I'm not sure how else to explain it. I heard it several times as I was watching television. It was quite annoying, but I did my best to just ignore it. I didn't figure it could possibly be anything important. I kept hearing that noise over and over again throughout the night though. After a while, I decided I was just going to go to bed and forget about it. I fell asleep pretty quickly. I was woken up in the middle of the night because I had to pee really badly. I got up and walked into the bathroom, did the routine. Afterwards, on the way back to my bedroom, I kept hearing that weird noise again. I walked into the living room and I saw something even stranger. There was an orange glow coming from out on the balcony. For the first time, I was really concerned. I snatched up a knife from my kitchen just to be safe. I walked over to the sliding glass doors. I grabbed the cord to open the blinds, pulled them open, and got the shock of my life. Sitting on the balcony, in the snow, were two extremely skinny and extremely pale men, completely naked. They had started a fire in my grill. One of the guys had his foot up against the window and was just rubbing it with his foot, making that noise. I realized they must have been out there all night because I'd been hearing that same noise for hours. I wondered how the guys didn't have frostbite. Upon seeing me, both men jumped up at the same time, revealing much more of their bodies than I ever wanted to see. One of the men began to hiss at me, which of course was just weird. They began to pound on the glass window. I didn't think they would have the strength to break the window, being so skin and bones as they were. But damn if it wasn't an extremely freaky sight. I showed them my knife and grabbed my cell phone, telling them I was calling the police. After slamming on my window for a few more minutes, they gave up. The guys jumped over the side of the balcony and appeared to drop off. It was pretty high up. I mean, it was on the 3rd floor. They must have landed in a snowbank or something. I don't know. The police weren't able to find anything after. I also never saw those two men again. It was so weird and scary. I have no idea how they even got up there in the first place. When I was 18 and moved out of my parents' house, I went to live in the Lakeview area of Chicago. I found a roommate whose apartment was only 1 block north of Wrigley Field. I really wasn't a baseball fan at the time, but it was still a pretty cool place to live. The thing I liked best was that there was always a lot of people around. I always found that sort of thing very cool. Well, I moved there in the winter though, and if you've ever spent a winter in Chicago, you know how rough it can be. It snows a lot, and after it snows, it gets really, really cold. This happened one night when I had to go to the store to grab some food. It was probably about 1 in the morning. I'm one of those backwards sleepers because I prefer being up at night and going to bed during the day. Anyway, it was snowing pretty hard, and I didn't have the greatest visibility. I cut through an alley, and when I did, I saw what I assumed to be a homeless guy stumbling about through the alley. In Chicago, you see a lot of homeless people who ask you for money. I'm generally pretty happy to give them some if I have it, but at this time, I had none to spare. When I walked past the guy, he of course asked me for some money. I apologized and told him I didn't have any on me. I kept walking in the snow. When I was about 50 feet away from him though, I looked back, only to see he had a bottle in his hand. He was glaring at me. Ironically, he screamed out, "You deadbeat!" He took the bottle and smashed it on the wall of a building. With the shattered bottle in his hand, the guy started charging in my direction. Terrified, I started to run, but when I looked back, the man was running full speed toward me. He was running extremely fast and coordinated for a drunk guy too. I didn't know what to do because it was a long alleyway with no way to escape. He was catching up to me quickly too. "I'm gonna cut you up, you damn deadbeat," he yelled at me as we went along. I was scared because the man was obviously drunk. That bottle that he had was really messing me up. As I turned to run down another alley, I slipped on some ice and fell on my ass. It hurt, and I screamed out. The guy was going to catch me now. I had no doubt about that. Fortunately, however, I recognized the area I was in. It was the alley behind a gay bar called Roscoe's. Now, I'm not gay, but I'm more than willing to go into a gay bar to escape a lunatic chasing me with a bottle. Forcing myself to get up, I ran over to the bar and tried to get in. The man at the front asked for my ID. I told him I was underage, but I also told him a crazy homeless guy was chasing me with a bottle and asked him to call the cops for me. The homeless guy stopped just short of coming into the bar. The guy I was talking to was huge. I mean, a bodybuilder type. I'm sure you've seen this kind of really big muscular guy before. I guess he also happened to be the bouncer, because he went outside and confronted the homeless man. I swear, the guy that was chasing me was scared to death in an instant of this enormous bouncer. Even though he was drunk, he kept his bottle at the ready. As the bouncer moved toward him though, he ran off like the Hulk himself was confronting him. Well, of course I was very appreciative of the man's help. He let me stay in the entryway of the bar while I waited for the police to arrive. I was too scared to go outside by myself, so the cops took me home after. I never saw that particular homeless guy again, but every time I walk by Roscoe's now, I wave to the kind man who may have saved my life that night. He always waves back to me too. What a great guy. This story actually happened to me when I was still living with my parents about 3 years ago. We moved to this new house at the end of 2019, right before lockdown, and multiple things began to happen there. One night around 7 p.m. or so, my mom and I were coming home from school. It was about a 20-minute ride. My mom has this weird habit of always checking who's behind us. That night, she noticed this car had been there for a few minutes already. To be sure we weren't just being paranoid, we slowed down and made 2 rounds in the roundabout. They ended up cutting us off at full speed on the small road going to our house, which wasn't really a busy road at all usually. We assume we must have been at the wrong place at the wrong time, and simply aggravated an incident of road rage or something. Fast forward to actual lockdown though. Everything was going pretty well, and we'd all collectively forgotten about that incident earlier. It was in May, so about 2 months after lockdown started. Almost by the end of it really. My sister was downstairs around 3 a.m., just hanging out in the living room. To give some context, my house has a lot of doors and windows in that area. At some point though, she noticed one of the doors slightly opening. She assumed that someone had forgotten to close it, and the wind must be blowing it open. When she tried to push it to lock it though, she felt like someone was putting their weight on it to open it up. She screamed as loud as she could and ran upstairs to my parents. They went into the backyard to check if anyone was there, but we didn't see anyone. We just thought it would be a one-time thing, but my mom wasn't so reassured. She started to stay during the night in the living room, just to make sure nothing else happened. During the next few weeks, indeed, nothing new happened. She asked me multiple times to stay with her, just to be her witness in case something ever did. Around 1 a.m., we were lying on the couch together. The lights were all off because I had a headache, and my mom was just kinda scrolling through her phone. All of a sudden, we saw a blinding light directed into our living room. It spooked me so much I was completely paralyzed in the moment. My parents went into the backyard to check, but there was still nothing. After that, we saw multiple lights and noises. We checked the surveillance camera, only to see a bunch of weird people at our gate, staring directly into our house. That's not exactly illegal though, so we couldn't do anything about it. This continued for a few months, driving my family insane. In 2021, while we were cleaning the backyard for summer, we suddenly discovered a big hole in the bushes, large enough to allow someone to fit through. We didn't know what to do, but now we had confirmation that someone was coming onto our property at night. Almost immediately after we discovered that hole though, all these incidents stopped happening, and that weird group stopped showing up as well. That made us believe that they knew we were onto them now, but we still don't have a clue about who they were, why they were doing that, or even if they wanted to do something bad to us. I usually get over creepy encounters fairly quickly, but this one was quite different from the rest. I go by the rule, be nice to everyone, because you never know who could be a secret serial killer or something like that. That's worked out pretty well for me the majority of the time. This time though, it was probably what got me into the situation in the first place. When I was 18, I worked as a lifeguard by a small pool. Nothing fancy, basically just a babysitter in the water. When adults got bored of looking after their kids, they sometimes sought me out, for some reason, to have a free therapy session. Mothers and fathers talking about their hardships. I know I worked as a lifeguard, but I can't exactly save that kind of life. One day, a 50-year-old man with his 2 kids came to the pool. As many other people did, he went up to me and started talking. It started with some small talk, like how he didn't let his children eat ketchup because it had the properties to remove rust from metals or something like that. As the hours went by, he started talking badly about one of his kids, how she was overweight, had anger issues, and was worried about boys when no one would ever look at her. I'm not gonna lie, that last statement made me go quiet. I tried to somewhat reason with him to not speak like that about his own daughter. He seemed to listen to what I had to say, so I was happy I could possibly help that kid in some kind of way. Having a parent like that would give anyone a hard time. The next day he came back, extremely happy it seemed, telling me I was so good with kids because my talk had apparently helped him. He then began the day-by-day trash-talking of his ex-wife into oblivion. I didn't say much because it felt like it wasn't my place to speak. I didn't want to create unnecessary drama at my workplace either. What set the first red flag in motion, though, was when the conversation suddenly shifted into him wanting a young wife. It was as if he was trying to trash talk his ex to get me to understand he was single and interested in a relationship with me. The days went by, and he continued to visit every single day. To some extent, I now got the feeling that he came every day just to see me. I was fairly creeped out by this thought. I tried to just ignore it and do my work. As the days passed, though, he started asking more and more personal questions. Things like, where do you like to do your grocery shopping? Is there a cafe close by where you live? What are your favorite hobbies in the area? They weren't direct. I was fairly sure he was trying to figure out where I lived without actually insinuating that's what he wanted to know. I kindly deflected all his questions, though, by either saying something very obscure or lying altogether. During my last work week there, I had an afternoon shift. I asked my colleague who had the morning shift if anything had happened that day that I should be aware of. He told me they'd had to ban a man from entering the pool area because he'd apparently broken behind the counter at the small pool shop where the workers kept all their personal things. Apparently, he'd been denied by my coworker to get a look at my work calendar, so he tried to sneak in and get a glance in a more illegal manner. That last week, I saw him twice at the end of my shifts, standing near the pool entrance, waiting for me. When I saw him there, I reported him to the pool security guards, and after that, I never saw him again. When I was about 16 years old, I used to hang out with my best friend Joe most days after school. It became not unusual for me to spend the majority of my days there. After school and on the weekends, I'd get home very late because of this. My family would usually already be in bed by the time I arrived. Joe lived on the other side of town, so the walk home was quite long. In order to get there as soon as possible, I always had to cut through this large cemetery in order to shave several minutes off of my journey. This happened to me late on a Saturday night. I'd been over at Joe's playing video games together for hours. We'd gotten pretty invested in the game, and before I knew it, it was already 2 a.m. It was too late to get in touch with my parents and ask permission to spend the night, so I headed home on my own. I guess most people might have thought the dark and quiet walk home was pretty damn creepy, but I didn't think twice about it. I didn't really get scared very much at that time. Hell, I walked through a graveyard on a regular basis. I was about a quarter of the way through said graveyard when I began to hear a strange series of noises that caused me to jump in my skin. It sounded like someone was yelling. Then there was a really loud sound, as if something had been cracked or broken. The third sound was a loud guttural noise that sounded like a human being growling or just making a loud noise out of frustration. I'm not sure how else to describe it, but right after I heard these noises, everything went quiet once again. I kept making my way through the cemetery, only now very freaked out for the first time in a long time. As I walked along, I had to keep very aware of what was going on around me. After hearing those noises, I hadn't heard anything else for a while. I was coming towards the very end of the graveyard when I heard something else. This time, however, it sounded like someone nearby was giggling. It continued. I had to walk in the direction of it to leave. When I came upon the source of the laughing, I was really shocked at what I saw. There was a tall monument, and a boy, probably only a couple of years younger than me, was sitting on top of it, swinging his feet back and forth. As I looked closer at him, he looked like he was injured or something. It was hard to tell in the dark, but he was holding his arm, which seemed to be broken or dislocated completely. Weirded out, I asked the boy if he was hurt or if he needed any help. He just laughed at me again. Then his face took on a serious look, and he told me to get the hell out of his cemetery right now. When he did, I noticed something else. There was another person there, leaning against one of the other monuments. It was a teenage girl, and she wasn't doing anything but staring straight at me. The whole situation was just way too weird. I couldn't piece together everything I had heard and then seen in the moment to make any sense of it. All I could do was do what he said. I got the hell out of the cemetery, listening to him laugh as I ran out. In the future, I always chose to take the extra minutes to walk around. There are some very strange people in this world, and that was a very strange encounter that night. When I was a teenager, I got a job at a local restaurant in order to save up money to buy myself a car. Because I was in school and had to work the night shift often, I wouldn't get out of the place until well after midnight. My parents were already in bed by that time, and because of that, I had to walk home since I didn't have a car. I lived in a pretty small and quiet town, so it was always a silent walk home, and nothing ever really happened. Except for once, when the walk took me up Main Street in town before I got into the residential area. It was a big change from the brightly lit street to the town to go into the forested and darkened area where all the houses were. I had to walk across a bridge, and there were only a few buildings next to the road. One was a gas station and a few small office buildings. Once I passed those, it was just trees. Though it was very quiet as usual, when I was about to turn onto the street in my neighborhood, I suddenly heard a very odd noise. It was like some sort of squealing sound, like an animal in pain or something. It wasn't that troubling at first. I thought it was just a random noise being made by some animal and tried to ignore it. But then it got a lot louder, and it sounded bone-chilling, a disturbing noise like something was being tormented. I told myself it must just be a cat attacking a bird or something, but it almost seemed like rather than just attacking the bird, the cat was torturing it actively. I was very unsettled. I turned on the street and crossed to the opposite side to be as far away from whatever was among those trees as possible. As I did so, the hideous noise finally stopped. The quiet afterwards was almost more unsettling though. As I walked up the street, there was a motion out of the corner of my eye. Turning around swiftly, I saw a movement among the trees. It certainly was not a cat. It was a large silhouette of a person, just standing there, probably looking at me, though I couldn't quite tell in the darkness. As I continued walking, I swiftly put two and two together and figured that whatever that noise had been, it had been caused by whoever this was. I just looked forward and tried to pretend I had never seen him. If you've ever walked while trying to avoid looking at someone, you'll know how that feels. I kept feeling the urge to look back as I walked along to see if the man was following me. I guess I didn't have any real reason to think he would be. I felt my insides freeze, though, when I heard footfalls that were not my own. After a few moments, I worked up the nerve to actually look back over my shoulder to see the man was following me very close behind, and he was holding something in his hand as well. I couldn't quite make it out in the darkness, but it seemed to be a baton or perhaps a knife. Whatever it was, he was making sure that I was able to see it. It didn't take more than a couple of seconds for me to put two and two together. If this guy was willing to do whatever the hell he was doing to whatever the hell that animal was, then there's no telling what he may have been willing to do to me. I decided to just say screw it and took off running. A quick look back over my shoulder showed the man had had the same idea as me. That large man was running after me, and he was waving whatever weapon he had in his hand all around. I had never been more terrified in my entire life. I was being chased by a psychopath, and I was still quite a bit away from home. I turned onto the next street and had the luckiest moment of my entire life. Even though it was well past midnight, there was a house with a porch, and about 5 men were on the porch sitting around and drinking beer. They immediately noticed what was going on, and I ran over to them, screaming for help. The guy chasing me faltered a bit and stopped when he noticed those guys. He didn't leave at first, though. He just stood there as I told the men he was trying to hurt me. One of them opened the front porch door and grabbed what appeared to be a shotgun. The guy chasing me stood there looking for a few moments before perhaps trying to decide if the porch guy really meant business. I guess he soon decided that he did though, because he turned around and ran back into the woods and left. I told the guys everything that had happened. They all got curious and wanted to go see what the guy had been doing amongst those trees in the first place. We went to go look, but I don't think you really want to know what we found. It was disgusting. My car was having some problems, so I had to put it in the shop. Unfortunately, it was going to be in there for a few days, so I got stranded at home over the weekend. By Saturday night, I was getting pretty stir-crazy and needed to get some exercise in. My gym was about 2 miles away from my apartment, so I decided I could simply walk there and get a good workout on the way. I got there around midnight and was very surprised to see that no one was there. There were no other customers, and the staff didn't usually stay after 6 p.m., so I had the place all to myself pretty much. While I was on the elliptical machine, I saw a car pull up outside, and someone got out. They stood at the door for a little while. Then they rang the doorbell. I, of course, just ignored him. Everyone who was a member had a key to the building, and we weren't allowed to let anyone in who didn't have a key. The guy didn't give up, though. He kept on ringing the doorbell. Then, obviously upset that I wasn't answering the door, he began walking circles around the building, trying to get my attention. When he was finally able to do so, he motioned for me to walk over to the door so I could let him in. I shrugged, letting him know I wasn't going to break the rules just for him. He made an exasperated face at me. Then he walked back over to the door. He seemed really annoyed, and he was a lot bigger than me as well. I at least knew, though, that he could not get into the gym. Then, I saw a large pickup truck pull into the parking lot. It parked right in front of the window that was in front of me. Its windows were heavily tinted, and I couldn't see who was inside. I started to get a bit worried, because if the driver had a key and then came into the gym, the other guy might slip in with him. Then confront me for not opening the door. What was weird, though, was that whoever was in this truck did not get out. He didn't even stop his truck. He just sat there with the truck running. I had about 15 minutes left on my cardio before I headed over to do some weights. The annoyed guy kept walking around the building, and the truck kept on running. I started wondering if maybe they were in cahoots or something. I tend to sweat a lot, so I went into the locker room to change my shirt. When I came back out, the guy who had been walking around was gone, but the truck was still idling there. About 15 minutes after I began lifting weights, the truck finally left, without the person ever having gotten out. About 45 minutes later, I decided it was about time to head home. There still wasn't anyone at the gym, so I had a pretty pleasant time there by myself. I went walking down the road to the main street. I had to pass a gas station in order to be on my way home. I froze when I realized that very same truck was waiting at the gas station. Even worse, as I was walking by, the man that had been trying to get me to let him into the gym was leaving the store of the gas station as well. He walked right over into the truck. I tried to just ignore them and went about my way. Unfortunately, the truck soon pulled out of the gas station and began following me along the quiet road. I was immediately very nervous. I turned onto a side street. It followed me there, too. When I got into the neighborhood area, and thus off the town roads, the truck switched on their high beams. Then they started moving much faster and right toward me. Knowing I couldn't outrun this truck, I instead ran into a yard off the side of a house, then into the backyard. I knew the truck couldn't follow me there. I ran through all the different backyards, trying to cut through and get back to my street. The guys in the truck had anticipated this, though, and somehow when I emerged, they were there waiting for me. The man who hadn't been let into the gym hopped out of the truck, carrying a baseball bat with him. I was too scared, and at first I was unable to move, not knowing what I should do. I soon made a choice, though, and ran to the nearest house, climbing the steps and pounding and screaming for someone to open the door. The lights in the house immediately came on, and I heard the truck take off behind me. I guess the guys hadn't anticipated me doing this. After they had left, I told the people in the house what happened. They offered to drive me the rest of the way home. You know, it's quite funny. You can meet the worst and best people all in the same night. I think I have a stalker. Well, had one at least. I'm an Israeli high school student. I have long brown hair, I'm about 179 centimeters tall, and weigh 68 kilograms. My encounter started in October of 2022 on a Jewish holiday called the Yom Kippur. It translates to Day of Repentance. Basically, it's just a day when Jews go to the synagogue to repent for their sins. They fast, and they also don't use any electricity during that time. On Yom Kippur, teens usually go into the town square and just chill there, meet new people, and talk. Being bored, I chose to go along with my peers in the hopes of finding some new friends. One of those new people I met was a girl. Let's call her Emma. I met Emma through some mutual friends. She went to another school in a different town and didn't often stay in mine, as her parents were divorced. Her mom had custody of her in the other town, while her dad lived in the same town as me. The best description of her is that she was 150 centimeters tall and 50 kilograms soaking wet. She had a kind of fusion between ginger and blonde hair, an inverted triangle face shape, and had a distinct piercing look to her green eyes. We talked for a bit, and she was shy and socially awkward. Eventually, I made up some bullshit excuse about my parents wanting me home, as it was getting quite late. Before I left, she asked me for my Instagram. I'm fairly active on social media, mostly posting memes and low-effort jokes that people seem to like occasionally. I started to notice, though, that she always viewed my stories first. Coincidence, maybe? It seemed to be seconds after I posted them, though. I suspected maybe she had friend notifications on, or maybe it was just my ego. She responded to a lot of them as well, texting in a flirty kind of way, with lots of heart emojis. I got a creepy feeling from her, but I assumed she was joking or something. Around December was the first time she tried to meet up with me. She persuaded me, but I don't crack under peer pressure, so I kept up making excuses because I didn't really want to meet. Around mid-January, she started texting me on WhatsApp as well. I'd never given her my number, so I had no idea how she got it. It was safe to assume that maybe one of our mutuals had given it to her or something. A bit creepy, but whatever. There were a lot of phone calls I missed because I was busy. She kept proceeding with stalking me, and I started to ignore her more, usually only responding with one-word answers to her texts. This started to make her angry, but I hoped that shutting her out would be the best way to proceed, and eventually she would get the hint. In February, though, she crossed a line, a big line. Out of the blue, she texted me the name of my street and a number. To try and throw her off my tail, I responded with a single question mark. She followed up immediately by telling me, "That's where you live, right? My friend told me you're afraid of me. That's not true, is it?" Being freaked the fuck out, I left her on red and hoped she'd just go away. In the meantime, I tried to figure out how she'd even gotten my address. Doing some digging online, I found out the address showed after searching for my father's full name, including his middle names, a name that I had never told her. She texted me again a few days later, asking me to let her come over to my house. I told her to leave me alone. She tried to convince me to take her out on a date, but I told her I was gay in response. She called me every slur in the book, some of which I'd never even heard before, which was quite impressive. I told my mutual friend all about it, and he later sent me a screenshot of a private story she'd posted, showing her crying and talking about how all men are evil. He asked if it was related to me. Probably it was. The following morning, she sent me a voice message from a fake account, telling me how she was sorry and that she loved me so much. I told her again, "I'm gay. You're nice and all, but I'm simply not interested." Afterward, there was silence. Had I finally reached peace at last? It had been a few days without hearing from her, and all was good. I quickly forgot about her existence. Around a week after the whole incident happened, though, my mom was supposed to drive me to school. When we went to get in the car, though, we noticed a tire was punctured. I got a bad feeling about this immediately. In hindsight, I also realized my dog had been barking maniacally the night before. I had just assumed that it was his usual barking at people walking past or something. I was starting to feel like I was delusional, and maybe this was all just coincidence. For the following days, I got a sinking feeling that something was wrong. I felt as if I was being watched at all times when I was following my routines, such as going to the gym or walking my dog. I thought I'd seen her around the mall and other shops I had frequented too. There were only 2 malls in my town though, so it wasn't that unlikely. She didn't seem to notice me at least. It was early March by that point, and my birthday soon approached. A day before my birthday, I suddenly got a flower bouquet delivered to me, along with balloons and a note saying I love you. No clue from whom, but I didn't bother to ask the delivery guy. I guessed it must be one of my friends fucking with me. They knew how on edge I was, but I soon realized that it was not from them. For my birthday, I decided to get drunk with some of my friends. I take antidepressants, so I often don't get shit-faced when I drink, only mildly drunk. The parents of my friend who lived 20 minutes away were on vacation, so he decided to host. I posted some pics of my stories, of us just messing around in his front yard. Eventually though, we'd made too much noise. The cops were called, and we had to cut the party short. Walking back home though, I started to feel very paranoid. I'm the type that gets worried when I drink, but I tried to ignore these thoughts. There was a woman that was keeping a short distance behind me, but again I ignored my gut in my drunkenness and assumed it was just a random person out for a walk. I stopped and rushed into some shrubbery because I had to barf real bad. Suddenly I felt my hair being pulled into a ponytail behind me. It was the lady who was walking behind me. She held my hair for me. She told me to sit down and to wait a bit before I continued. I sat down cross-legged with my face looking down. I had my face down out of shame because I was afraid I'd suddenly puke all over her if I raised my face to look. I caught a few glimpses though, and she seemed very familiar. She began to get very touchy, but I was a bit out of my senses in the moment, as you could imagine. She was getting really touchy though, and started moving her hand down to my nether regions. I finally told her to stop. I looked her in the face to try and confront her, when I suddenly figured out exactly who this was. I'd assumed that maybe she was a neighbor or a local to the area or something, but it clicked even in my drunken state. It was Emma. She was dressed differently and had her hair done a different way, but her eyes gave her away. I tried to get up, but I just couldn't. I was too dizzy. She grabbed my shoulder. I told her to leave me alone. She put her hand under my chin, and that was it. I don't remember why, but I just reflexively punched her. It was one punch with the weak power of a drunken man, but a punch to the throat is still a punch. She backed off. I stumbled away and cried on the way home. I'm a pacifist and I've never punched another person. It was against my morals. I still feel guilt about it, even though all she's done to me. The next day, I got a message from an unknown number telling me I'm a dead man and they were going to kill me. Ever since, nothing's happened though. I'm still paranoid. It's nearly June and I haven't heard from her since March, but I still can't let that wary feeling go. Growing up, I had a best friend named Lloyd. We grew up as regular old country boys, having all sorts of fun together. We collected baseball cards, played with our toy guns, went to the pool. We did just about everything together. When my dad took me out hunting for the first time, Lloyd came along then as well. Growing up, we really were inseparable. This happened when the two of us were in high school. Lloyd and I lived just off a rural route way out of town. This was a very poor area, and we both lived in pretty old, run-down houses. This was in the 1980s. We had grown up in the 70s and early 80s. My family was fortunate enough to have a color television, but we didn't have anything like cable. That didn't matter too much to us kids, though, because most of the stuff we did was outside. It was a really hot summer night when this happened. Lloyd was over at my house, which was usual. We were both 16 years old at the time. We had been in my room listening to music together pretty much all night long. After a while, though, we began to get a little bit bored. Lloyd wanted to smoke a couple of joints that he had on him. He thought that we could get away with it in my room, but there was no way I was going to let him do that here. I couldn't take the chance of my dad smelling it. I didn't really know if he would have gotten in trouble for it or not, but it was not a chance I was willing to take. We lived right on the edge of a huge forest. It was a place we had explored in, hunted in, hung out in, and even smoked joints in before. I let Lloyd know that if he really wanted to smoke so badly, then we should probably go for a quick walk in the woods. It was already past midnight, but that was no big deal to us. We had often gone for walks really late at night before. My dad was still awake, watching television. We let him know that we were bored and going for a quick walk. He didn't really care all that much, just told us to be careful and take a flashlight with us. He also suggested I take my rifle out with me as well, which I decided to do just to make him happy. Since we lived in an extremely rural area, it wasn't unusual for a kid my age to have his own gun. We set out and began smoking as soon as we got out into the woods. It was extremely dark outside, so we had to use the flashlights right away. There were some paths to walk on, created by years of people simply walking through the forest. We just walked along those, deeper and deeper into the trees. For a while, the walk was just a normal walk. We didn't have anything happen or hear anything out of the ordinary. After a while, though, we noticed something lying off to the side of the path we were on. As we got a bit closer, we were pretty shocked by what we saw. There was a dead deer just lying on the ground. That in itself was not unusual, but it was cut up pretty bad. It was like some animal had killed and mauled it only in the area it was wounded in. What was especially weird was that many of the edible parts of the deer were left over as well. It seemed strange to both of us that any animal would have done this and left so much meat there. "Hey, what if we run into a bobcat or something that did this?" Lloyd asked me. I held up my rifle. "That's what we have this for." Don't misunderstand me, however. I wasn't going looking for something to kill. I would just absolutely use my rifle to protect myself from whatever was out there. We didn't think a whole lot more about it, and kept walking through the woods and smoking. Now, though, we were listening to the noises around us much more closely. We were talking about the possibility of a bobcat, and I guess the more we talked about it, the more we convinced ourselves one might be out there. We were not too scared, though. I don't know how long we were out or when we decided to turn around and head back toward my house, but eventually we did so. It was pretty late into the night. We were pretty stoned at that point too, but no more than we were used to being. It was on the way back that Lloyd began to get a little bit paranoid. He kept on telling me he was hearing things out in the woods. I wasn't hearing any of the noises he described myself, and I told him he was just being paranoid because he was stoned. He was absolutely confident, though, that he was hearing something out there. He was confident something was walking the woods with us. He began getting really worried that another animal was out there, stalking us. I still couldn't hear the noises he'd been talking about, though. The more we walked along, the more paranoid he got. He kept asking me, whispering over and over, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" I hadn't heard any of the things he was talking about, though. When we crossed back toward the area we'd originally seen that deer, we were surprised to see it was already no longer there. This just increased Lloyd's paranoia, and he began scanning the area, trying to see if an animal had dragged it off somewhere. "Holy shit," I heard his whisper as he grabbed my arm. Lloyd made me look over into the woods, but wouldn't shine his light in that direction. Although it was dark, I could see what looked like a large figure somewhere out in the woods. It was moving around, too. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it over at whatever it was that we were looking at. We saw the deer, and whatever this big figure was obviously pulling it. It quickly darted out of the way before we could fully shine the light upon it. However, we had both seen this. For the first time, I was just as scared as Lloyd, or perhaps even more. I didn't know who or what we just saw, but after what we remembered from seeing the deer and what we had seen in the dark, I knew someone or something was out there. To let them know we were armed, I took my rifle and fired one shot into the air, hoping that would scare whatever it was away. "We need to get out of here," Lloyd told me. I agreed, and the two of us began jogging along the path to get out of the woods. We were scared of that thing that might have killed that deer. We wanted to get as far away from it as possible. We didn't know if it tried following us, but we got out of the woods as fast as we could. What we had seen was not very far from the house either. We both rushed in and locked the doors behind us. It was hot outside, and we usually kept the doors open. They were usually left unlocked too, so this was a very rare thing. The two of us went and hid out in my room and kept the gun with us, fully loaded. We didn't sleep at all that night. I guess that really shouldn't be surprising though. About a month later, this really huge guy was arrested in those woods, not far from our house. Apparently, he'd attacked a police officer who had stopped to question him. I have no doubt it was the very same person we saw that night. I always used to enjoy taking my dog on a walk through the woods every day. I lived out in the country by myself. For the most part, when I took my dog for a walk, I would take him through the same area every time. One day, however, I decided to travel out in a completely different direction, and that resulted in me seeing the strangest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was nothing more than a decision made out of boredom, but I took my dog alongside the dirt roads past the driveway, then out into the hills that were opposite my house. Like my normal walks, we were out there for quite a long time. We weren't hunting or anything, but my dog and I like to take really long walks in the country as if we were. I didn't even have to leash him, as he never went too far from me, and he always came back right away when I called. Beside being a little more dense than the forest we usually walked in, this was not too much of a different journey. We were having a good time walking through the woods and enjoying what we were seeing. My dog, Roscoe, had been running around looking at various things. He had beaten me over the top of the hill, and I was trying to get up there to check on him. Before I even made it to the top, though, he came running back over the hill to me. When he caught up to me, he turned and tried to lead me up the hill all over again. "Did you find something interesting, boy?" I asked him. Roscoe turned and began running back over the hill. I stepped up my pace and made it over as well to see where he was going. Once I made it over, I noticed something that really surprised me. It looked like there was an old cabin on the other side of the hill. Since Roscoe was over right by this cabin, I figured that must be what he was barking about. I really didn't want to bother whoever was living out in the woods like that. I knew better than to get involved with those people. I tried calling Roscoe over and over, trying to get him to come back to me, but for some reason he would not do it. I was very nervous as I walked up to him. He wasn't barking or anything, so it was possible anyone living inside hadn't heard him yet. I tried my best to be as quiet as possible and tried to go up to Roscoe so I could grab him by the collar and lead him away. As I got up to him, though, I looked over to the other side of the cabin that I hadn't seen before, and that's when I noticed something really strange. There was a tree that was really close by the side of the cabin. Hanging from this tree were all sorts of shoes. They were all different kinds and pairs, most of them in many different sizes. They all had their strings tied together, and then the strings were tied to different branches on the tree. Most of them looked like they'd been up there for a long time, heavily beaten by the weather. Some of the shoes on that tree, however, looked like they had been put there more recently and were not as weathered by the elements. All in all, it was the weirdest thing I had ever seen, and the most disturbing thing as well. I tried to be as quiet as I could as I led Roscoe away from the area. I thought if I led him down the hill, we could get back to the road and take that back home. As we kept on going downward though, I smelled something pretty nasty. It got worse and worse until we got to the very bottom of the hill. At the bottom, I saw the most disgusting thing I had ever seen in my life. There was a pile of what appeared to be rotted and decaying roadkill or something of the like at the bottom of that hill. It was vile, and I had to do everything I could to keep from puking. I grabbed Roscoe by the collar and quickly led him away. We eventually got back to the dirt road. I used it and took my dog home with me. I don't know exactly what I saw that day. Between the weird shoe tree and that pile of decaying meat, it was the weirdest shit. But then again, a lot of times if you go hiking where you're not supposed to, you'll find the weirdest sights. I inherited my parents' home when they both passed away when I was in my early 20s. I was not in a relationship and didn't have any children either, so I moved in all alone. It was a pretty big house to live in alone, but I didn't want to get rid of it or sell it or anything like that. And because of that, I stayed there for a very long time by myself. I was a single female living in a big house in town all by my lonesome. My next-door neighbors, or at least the ones who owned the house at the time, did not live there. They rented the house out to several people throughout the time I had been living there. I'd had neighbors that I played with their children while growing up, and I also had people who lived there who we never even spoke a word to at all. When I owned the house, not much had changed. Well, about 2 years after I inherited it initially, the people who rented the house next door moved out, and it stayed empty for about a month or so. When someone new finally moved in, I came outside onto the porch to see who it was. I always liked to greet whoever moved in. Like my house, it was a big 3-bedroom family-sized home, so I expected a family to be moving in. When I went over to greet the man who I saw moving things in, I quickly realized he was moving in all by himself. He did not have anyone else moving in with him. And it wasn't surprising why. There was immediately something very off and very creepy about this guy. I noticed it right away. He wasn't talkative at all, and kept looking at me in a way that made me feel very strange. When I excused myself and went back to my home, I just decided this was not going to be one of the more friendly neighborhood relationships I was going to have there. It didn't really bother me much though, because I figured that like most neighbors over the years, he wouldn't be here forever anyway. Things continued to be strange with him as the weeks passed by. He wouldn't really ever talk to me. If I came out of the house though, and he was on his porch, he would stare at me the entire time I was outside. His eyes would always follow me to my car and watch me whenever I drove away. I guess I should have worried about him breaking into my house and stealing my stuff or something, but I never did. I could always tell from his eyes that that sort of thing was not important to him. He seemed like he was interested in me for some reason. After some time of things keeping up like that, I came to the conclusion that he was harmless enough. Not so long after that, though, I had seen him watching me from one of the windows of his house whenever he could catch a glimpse of me. That was much creepier than him just watching me from his porch, but I tried not to think about it too much. One night, about 7 months after he moved in, I'd gotten home pretty late from work. I just wanted to have a couple of glasses of wine and take a quick bath. I was doing a good job at finally relaxing after a very stressful work day. My bathroom was on the second floor of the house. After I was done with my bath, I dried off and put on my robe. I decided to go down to the second floor and grab myself another glass of wine. I was walking around in the dark like I tend to do. I have somewhat good night vision. I got the bottle out of the refrigerator and poured a glass, keeping the door open. Then I placed the bottle back inside. When this refrigerator door was open, it faced the back of my house and blocked my back door. I closed it, and the kitchen went dark again when the light inside went out. After the couple of seconds it took for my eyes to adjust, I saw something out the back window. It was only for a few moments, but I was sure of it. There was a man who was looking in the back window of my house, and there was no doubt at all it must be my next-door neighbor. Within a moment of me catching sight of him, he was already gone. Now, I didn't scream or panic or anything, but I did grab my phone and call the police. I let them know exactly what I had seen. I didn't have any proof that the man was at my back door, but in a moment of irony, I really didn't need it actually. The scariest revelation of my life also ended up being the very thing that helped me. The police revealed to me that my neighbor was a convicted sex offender. The reason they didn't need proof that he was at my door to arrest him was because he'd actually failed to register long before he moved in. He went to jail and was evicted as my neighbor. I was scared to death when I was told this by police. It made me think of the possibilities with a person like that living next door. It's a good thing they caught him when they did. This story happened when I was about 13 or 14. I grew up in a town with a lot of walking/biking trails in a forest area about a 10-minute walk away from my house. I spent a lot of time outside because of this. One of my best friends, we'll call him Anthony, lived in the neighborhood just across from mine. I would walk frequently to his house, knock on his door, and see whether he wanted to join me in biking aimlessly around town. On this particular day, he decided to join me, and we went down to the local lake, an extremely popular spot during the summer. It's basically never empty. There's a trail right next to the local library, which leads down to the lake. We decided to hang out by the trail entrance, as it was right next to a tunnel that ran under the street above, providing some pretty good shade and amplification for listening to music together off our iPods. This tunnel was probably a good 20 feet long or so, with the only easy path back up to the street above being the paved one on one side. The trail itself was made of gravel, with heavy trees on both sides. No easy way to get off with a bike, unless you use the designated entrances and exits. Anthony and I were hanging out on the opposite side of the tunnel from the trail entrance, so as to not bother any families getting on the trail with our music. We had our bikes leaned up on the side of the tunnel, when I noticed a man coming through on the opposite end, right next to the trail entrance. He entered the tunnel, and once he was about 15 feet away, he called out to us, "I'm a city name, police officer." It didn't take more than a 2-second glance to tell you he obviously was not. He was wearing cargo shorts, a green tank top, sandals, and a big military-style backpack. Even from about 15 feet away, I could tell his skin was really greasy, and his hair was unkempt as well. I immediately knew something bad was about to happen, and my adrenaline started to rush. I turned to my friend and yelled at him to run, to which he hopped on his bike and began to ride off. The man was standing between us and the trail entrance, so there was no easy way for us to take off without either needing to go directly past him or down the trail in the opposite direction. Anthony chose to ride for the main entrance that the man was blocking. As he rode past, the man reached out and grabbed his arm. Anthony sort of stopped, but the man seemed to be more focused on me and ended up letting go, after which Anthony quickly took off. I knew I wouldn't be as lucky as he was, though, if I tried to push my way past the man. Immediately, I started looking for other ways to run. I noticed there was actually a small dirt trail on the same end of the tunnel we'd been on. I tried to take my bike up it, and the man yelled after me, "Didn't your parents ever teach you not to run from the fucking cops?" The trail was too small for me to carry my bike down, so I just dropped it on the ground and continued running on foot, hoping this side trail led back up to the street, where he at least wouldn't be able to hurt me without any witnesses. He chased me about halfway down the trail, but eventually turned around. I ended up coming out at the library and quickly ran to the top of the tunnel so I could see what he was doing. All I saw was him riding off on my bike. I called the cops, and they came to my house to give me a lineup after I walked home. I instantly identified the guy. Apparently, he and his twin brother were homeless and on meth, which would explain his demeanor and motivation. They were known for stealing bikes in the area, but never so brazenly. I was just glad the situation wasn't worse, because based on his substance use, he could have easily chosen violence at the drop of a hat. My uncle and his wife lived in this old cabin out in the mountains. By old, I don't just mean it had been there for a few decades. Everything about it was practically ancient. It had no electricity or heating other than a single old stove, and had no indoor plumbing either. When I visited, I had to bring lots of soda and bottled water, because there was no running water at the cabin. It was really about as rustic as I could imagine it getting, but I enjoyed visiting that place. These sorts of places are nice to go to, as long as I was only going for a short visit. Usually when I was visiting my grandma with my parents, my uncle would come down as well, and take me up to the cabin for a few nights. This particular visit, I was visiting during the very late fall. It was in fact the weekend after Thanksgiving, I believe. We drove up there on Friday, and I was to stay until Saturday morning. That Friday evening was not really anything special. However, on Saturday, a friend of my uncle's came and asked for his help. He and my aunt left early in the afternoon, but insisted they would not be gone for very long. Not too long after they'd initially left, the sky blackened very quickly, and snow began to fall. It fell hard and it fell heavy, quickly coating the ground. I was concerned whether my uncle would be able to come back at all to the cabin. He drove a Jeep, but the roads were very thin already, and now they would be thin and slippery. If he wasn't able to make it back, I would have no way to get in contact with him. There was no phone or any other communication device in the cabin. The snow continued piling up, and the afternoon came and went. When night fell, the snow was piled really high. I had never been in that cabin by myself before, especially late at night. I was really frightened because of this. I was concerned I wasn't going to see my uncle return that day, and I really did not want to be out here all alone. When the snow had piled up insanely high, and it was extremely dark outside, I was convinced my uncle was not going to be coming back anytime soon. As I mentioned previously, there was no phone, so he couldn't call me to let me know either. I went out onto the porch to make sure I had enough wood for the fire. Then I noticed a single headlight coming towards the cabins. I knew immediately that whoever this was not my uncle. It appeared to be someone on a snowmobile of some sort. My uncle had taken his truck with him and didn't always hang out with the best people either. In fact, he knew a lot of drug dealers and such. I didn't want to come in contact with someone I didn't know, so I quickly gathered up my firewood and made my way back into the cabin. I locked the door and put my wood down by the stove. I didn't have any of the lanterns on, so other than the smoke from the stovetop, there was no indication anyone was there. The snowmobile pulled up quietly, and I peeked out the window. I saw the outline of a large man coming towards the house. I wondered why anyone would be out in the middle of such a violent snowstorm. The man began to pound on the door. I didn't answer or make any sound. I hoped he would know my uncle wasn't there, based on the fact that his truck wasn't there either. I guess in hindsight, the smoke from the chimney contradicted that. There was a furious pounding at the door, and I decided to simply continue remaining quiet. Yeah, I know. I didn't exactly know for sure there was a reason to be scared right now, but I really didn't want to interact with any of my uncle's quote-unquote friends all by myself. When there was no answer, the guy began putting his full body weight on the door. He began screaming out my uncle's name loudly. When the pounding didn't get him an answer, he began to try to force the door open. It wasn't a thick door at all. In fact, it was very thin. For some reason, it held even though it rattled furiously. I thought the guy had eventually given up because the door stopped rattling for a few moments. It was quiet for a while. I thought the guy had moved away already. Then, though, I heard a really loud slamming noise. The door rattled again. Then, once more, it was quiet. The light shining from the snowmobile was soon gone as the vehicle raced off into the night. I grabbed one of the lanterns and turned it on. I was startled when I saw the blade end of a huge knife stuck in the door. I quickly turned off the lantern, just in case the guy was coming back. I crawled into a cupboard by the stove and eventually fell asleep. My uncle and his wife came back in the morning. He walked into the house with a knife in his hand and a sheet of paper as well. I assumed it was a note from the guy last night who was riding the snowmobile. It had obviously been pierced by the blade of the knife to stick it in the door. My uncle didn't tell me what was written on the paper, and after I told him about the visit, he took me down off the mountains and never told me about what happened that night. The most frightening thing to ever happen to me just happened to happen during the worst snowstorm I have ever experienced. I live in an apartment building. It was a bit of a middle-income sort of place. It wasn't too fancy, but it wasn't bad either. I lived alone. The storm itself had started the previous night. The snow fell steadily throughout the night, and when I woke up in the morning, it was still dark out. The sky was also still overcast. The snow had piled up in the meantime, and it didn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. I got a phone call from my place of work, telling me not to come in. They had closed because of the storm and all the piling snow. I spent the day watching the snow fall down and becoming a bit stir-crazy. It was obviously too dangerous to risk driving somewhere in that sort of weather. And I wasn't the type to just sit around and watch TV or even read all day either. I liked being out and about in the world. Like I said though, I would have been stupid to attempt to drive in that weather. The day was spent mostly watching TV and trying to do random exercises around the house, using some of my at-home exercise equipment. It was a poor substitute for what they had at a gym. When I went to bed that night, the snow still had not stopped falling though. I had never witnessed a storm like this. I went to bed and didn't sleep that great. Really, it was just hard to sleep at all, as I hadn't really been able to relax during the daytime. I got up sometime during the night to go use the bathroom. I was used to stumbling around my apartment in the dark. I went inside and peed, then flushed the toilet before I groggily stumbled back to bed. I decided, though, that I should quickly go and check to see if the snow was still falling. I pushed aside the curtain, and the building light hurt my eyes for a moment. When they adjusted, I peeked outside the window and saw there was still a steady fall of snow. Okay, well, I guessed I would be off the following day from work as well. I let go of the curtain and turned around. For a split second, though, I thought I saw some sort of mud or something on my carpet, something that hadn't been there before. I was guessing in the moment it was an optical illusion, but knowing I wouldn't be able to go back to sleep until I checked this mystery out, I went over and turned on the light. I was completely shocked to see that there were prints all over my carpet. I held my breath when I saw the prints came from my front door, went down the hallway and into my bedroom, and then stopped there. I knew they couldn't be my own because I hadn't gone outside at all during the day. I knew inside that I should probably just leave, but I needed to know what was going on first. I slowly crept my way over to the bedroom. I turned on the hallway light, which illuminated part of my room. Then I peeked inside. I could see, just out of sight, lying under my bed, seemingly looking right at me, was a man. That means he'd been under my bed while I was sleeping the entire time. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my cell phone and ran out of the apartment. It was still the middle of the night. I didn't want to knock on anyone's doors. However, there was a laundry room on my floor. The door was wide open. I ran inside, then closed and bolted it behind me. From there, I called the police, and I didn't leave that laundry room until they arrived soon after. Although the guy had already fled my apartment, They found him hiding on another floor of the building. He was arrested and charged with trespassing. He had 2 knives on him. It turns out they tied him to several other break-ins in the neighborhood as well. This happened not too long after I moved to England. Back then, and still to this day even, my country's living conditions weren't all that great, with everything getting worse every year. Low salaries and high cost of living. I decided I had had enough. Not too long before that, my best friend had moved to England with her boyfriend and her dog. They lived in a house with a spare room, so we planned it out. I moved to their house and shared the rent, while I tried to find a job and my own place. We didn't last too long in that arrangement though, as 2 weeks after I'd moved in, we moved into a different house altogether. The house itself was supposed to be way better, but the neighborhood it was in, well, let's just say it had a lot to improve on. The real problem though was that my friends had that dog, and most nights they would get into huge fights about who was the most tired from work, who worked the hardest, who did the most at home. Other nonsense I didn't really have the patience to endure. Because of this, I would always end up offering to take the dog for his walk myself, just so I wouldn't have to listen to them fight anymore. It would usually go pretty well, I think especially because this was around pandemic time, so there were a lot less people out on the street. One night, though, was very different. When I offered to take the dog and walked out of the house with him, I had this strange feeling already. Like that night I shouldn't have offered to go and should have just stayed home or something. Then again, maybe it was best it was me and not my friend. Back then I was 25, going on 26. Well-built and broad-shouldered and could easily hold my own in a fight. Even though I'm not particularly tall, I would probably present a bigger threat than my friend still. I went down the stairs, walked out of the building with a trash bag in hand, dumped the bag, and went on my way to the close entrance. As always, when I got to the main road, because I like to keep the walks different and fresh for the dog, I looked both ways to decide which way to go tonight. That's when, to my left, I noticed a man jogging in my direction. What troubled me, though, was that he was jogging in completely normal day-to-day clothes, not dressed to go out for a run at all. I didn't want to be judging though, and didn't want to make myself uneasy for no reason, so I decided to just walk the other way and try to ignore this guy. If he really was running my way, I would simply cross the road and see where he went. I wasn't the only one feeling uncomfortable though, because the dog was refusing to just go about our way. He was an intense dog with a massive focus when it came to trouble, a mix between a bulldog and a Portuguese hunting dog breed. So he was medium-sized, muscular, and had this habit of staring people down in a way that would make everyone uncomfortable. That's exactly what he did in that moment. I turned to my right, started walking down the street, and had to pull the dog along every 5 seconds. He just would not stop turning around and staring at this guy, who was still about 30 seconds of jogging away from us. I was now keeping my eye on the guy as well, taking advantage of having to pull the dog along to keep measuring just how far the guy was from us. When he was starting to get too close for comfort, I decided to cross the street. If he was just running past, he would be on his way. If something else was happening here, though, he would cross the street as well. Of course, that's exactly what happened. When I started crossing the street, the guy made the same move right behind me. I decided to stop in place and let the dog stare the guy down to see what would come of this interaction. Instantly, it was like I had messed everything up for him. He looked surprised, stopped running, and stayed in place. He then lifted his hands like he was surrendering. "Hey man, all good bro, all good?" I simply replied, "All good, you?" "Yeah, boss, yeah." Then he walked ahead of us and finished crossing the road. I went back to the same side I'd been on initially, and thought that would be it. No further trouble. Then though, the guy stopped again, turned around, saw I was not on his side of the road anymore, and did the weirdest shit. He took 2 steps back up the road and just hid behind a tree. It was like he was hiding from someone else that was ahead on the street. This made me even more uncomfortable. I now had to control my shaking legs, adrenaline, and increasing heartbeat, and not give my discomfort away. I kept walking ahead and walked past the guy hiding behind the tree on the opposite side of the road. I looked him in the eye to warn him without having to say anything and kept on walking. 10 more steps was all it took. With this strange hiding guy behind me, I heard something shuffle up ahead in the street. Initially, I thought it could be an animal, but I stopped. I listened closer and decided the shuffling sound sounded like it was coming from something way bigger than just a dog or a fox or something. Certainly another person. That's when I noticed it. There was someone else, hiding behind one of the upcoming houses' trash cans, just waiting for me to get there. I could see part of their back sticking out from one of the sides. I don't know if me and the dog could have taken them or not, but I decided I would not risk it in that moment, let alone risk the dog's life as well. I turned around and swiftly started walking up the street again. I walked past the first guy, who was still huddled behind the same tree. I nodded to him. The surprise on his face confirmed everything to me. He must not have been expecting me to understand what was going on and see that guy hiding further ahead. They certainly were not expecting me to simply turn around and walk away. Heck, I doubt the first guy even expected me to notice him hiding at all. For the night, I decided to just let the dog do his business in the grass area behind our building, and that was it. Considering this is a very dangerous and high-crime neighborhood, which just keeps on getting worse, and a month later my boss's son and his friends were mugged at knife point with a machete just up the road from where this happened, I think I made the right choice that night. This is one of those stories that might not really seem too scary, more weird and creepy. Whenever I tell this to people, they sometimes laugh. Other times they shudder at the pure strangeness of it. I guess it's important to know that when this happened, we didn't have any snow on the ground. It had snowed nearly a week previously. The snow had all melted in the meantime. This occurred in the evening. I had a friend over for dinner. I had the meal all prepared and had the table all set as well. My friend was sitting at the table waiting to eat when my doorbell suddenly rang. I was caught off guard because I really didn't know anyone else in the building. The only reason I could figure someone would ring my doorbell was if they were complaining about noise or selling something. I really didn't make too much noise. I told my friend he could begin eating, and I would go check the door to see who this was. I got up and walked down the hallway to the apartment door. When opening it, I saw the strangest sight I'd ever seen in my life. There was a little boy standing at the door. He was wearing a thick winter coat that was covered in snow. It was as if he had just come inside from the snow. Only there wasn't any snow outside for him to come inside from. I must have done a double take or something. I wasn't sure what to make. It was surely a strange sight. Not only that, but the boy didn't say anything either. He just kinda stood there, staring at his feet. The snow was melting and dripping from his coat onto the carpeted floor. I asked this child if I could help him with something. He didn't look up, but he did slightly shake his head no. He just stood there. I asked him if I knew him from somewhere or something. Again, he didn't look up, just shook his head for a brief moment. I was at a loss as to what was going on here. Finally, the little boy whispered something I'll never forget. In a small voice, he said, "Sometimes people die in the cold." Then he went back to doing nothing, except staring at the floor. I was concerned for this child, obviously. I decided I would go and get my friend. I retrieved him, but when we got back to the door, the boy was already gone. There was only a red spot on the floor where he'd been. We looked for him throughout the building, but we couldn't find him anywhere. I reported this incident to the apartment manager, just in case someone was looking for the boy. The situation was way too weird though. I mean, I had no idea why he was covered with snow, but there was certainly no snow on the ground outside. I had no idea where he went either. When he was done talking to me, he just sort of disappeared. Most of all, I have no idea why he said what he said in that moment. Now, this might not seem too scary to you, but it sure as hell scared me at the time. This happened about 30 years ago, when I was in my early 20s or so. Back then, I lived in a very rural area. It was not easy to find jobs at the time, especially in the area I lived in. It was just outside of a very small town, which had long ago died out. Most of the business in this small town had closed down, and the few jobs that actually did exist around here were already filled. It was impossible to even find a job at the local McDonald's. That's how bad it was. I was able, though, thanks to a friend, to find a job in a factory eventually. It wasn't the most ideal job in the world, though, due to multiple things. First off, it was a third shift job, and I was not used to working overnight. That wasn't so bad, though, compared to the fact that it was a nearly hour-and-a-half drive just in order to get to and from work. It paid decently though, and I really needed the work, so I took this job. I was able to take turns driving with my buddy who'd initially gotten me the job, so that saved us some gas money at least. It wasn't really too terrible, at the time anyway. Now, the job itself might be a setting for a pretty scary story in itself. I mean, it was a factory, and it didn't do any production during the third shift. There were a few maintenance workers there and a few security guards as well. I was one of those security guards. Other than that, though, the huge factory was largely dark and empty. That's not where this scary story took place, though. Me and my buddy Tony had been driving to work 5 days a week for several months now, through the summer, when this story took place. We had to get to the factory and signed in and everything by midnight, so we tended to leave just before 10 p.m. It was a fall day, and it was obviously a very rural drive to the factory. To set the scene, it was very chilly outside. The leaves were falling from the trees pretty heavily. Although it wasn't raining hard or anything, it was very misty and damp outside that night. This day, Tony was driving us in his old pickup truck. It was a really small and old Isuzu truck, so not anything special. Usually, the roads were pretty dead, and a long portion of the drive was through the hills. After a short period of time, though, we realized there was a car behind us. It wasn't too big a deal, just a bit unusual. However, the guy kept switching his lights from his regular beams to his high beams every now and then. After having the high beams on for a few moments, he would put them back to normal. Since Tony was driving, this was annoying him a lot more than it was annoying me. After a while, he got sick of it and slammed the brakes on his car. This caused the car, which had been following us for quite a while at this point, to hit its brakes as well. We heard it skid a bit on the slick roads. Tony was pretty happy with himself. Still, it didn't do any good though. The car continued following us and continued occasionally flipping back and forth from his regulars to his high beams and back again. Tony was getting annoyed, but I tried to convince him not to go and just slam his brakes again. The road was too slippery, and I didn't want to take the chance that somebody would skid off the road. I'm not too sure how long that car had followed us through the hills, when suddenly something really weird happened. Some lights in the car began flashing on and off. This was a regular car though, not a police car, and the lights were pure white, not red and blue. They were flashing from inside the car though, like they were police lights. The car also began flashing its high beams even faster. Tony wasn't sure what to do, but we decided just in case this guy was an unmarked cop car or something, we should at least pull over first. If he wasn't, we would just drive off after, and it would be the end of the annoying encounter. Well, Tony pulled the truck over, and the other car pulled over as well. This time, he kept his high beams on, plus the white lights were still flashing in his car. I was convinced now, though, that this was not a police car. The lights were simply strobe lights. The whole thing seemed weird, and it made no sense that if this guy was a cop, that any of this behavior would even be occurring. The driver hopped out of the car and began walking over. I watched him closely from the back window of the cab of this little truck. It happened for just a moment, too. I saw the man was holding what looked like a rifle, and he was holding it like he was preparing to fire right now. I smacked Tony on the arm. "That's not a cop," I told him. "Drive away now!" Tony looked confused, but I urged him to hurry. He slapped the car in drive and began pulling away from the side of the street. Almost immediately, we heard a shot fired from the rifle of the man. We both flinched, worried about getting hit, but we seemed to be okay. Tony slammed on the gas, and even though that little old truck didn't have much power to it, we took off right away. I kept watching at the back window. I kept expecting to see this car with its high beams and flashing lights following us. I was sure it was not a cop now, but they would absolutely begin following us. However, after we lost sight of the car, we didn't see it again after that. We knew then for sure it was definitely no good. We kept driving to work. We didn't know what to do, really. We didn't see much point in reporting it to the police. We had almost no information on the vehicle, so we didn't see how it would do any good. Instead, we just kept driving and went to work like nothing ever happened. Tony and I never found out anything about what happened that night, but being fired at, even though the truck had not been hit, was a very scary experience. We never experienced anything like that ever again either. My brother and I used to work security at this really old quarry. I never really quite understood the job, to tell you the truth. If you had seen the quarry at any time during the day, you would have just assumed it to be abandoned. It truly came across that way. It seemed there was no real work being done there except every once in a great while. However, there were always 2 security guards who were there in the morning and overnight. There was a period of time, though, from about 6 p.m. until the 2 of us arrived at 8 p.m., that there was no one present at all. My brother Travis and I were headed into work that evening. It was a hot summer day, and we really weren't looking forward to the job. It mostly consisted of us sitting in a small building all night that was not air-conditioned, and sometimes walking around the quarry to make sure there were no intruders. I never understood, though, why anyone would break into the place at the first place. There was a bunch of nothing there to steal even. We got to work a little bit before 8 p.m., and we noticed something quite strange right away. The entrance gates were wide open. We'd had them unlocked before. The daytime security guards were not the greatest or most diligent workers in the world, but this was the first time they'd ever been wide open. We didn't really think too much about it, really. We drove in and Travis got out, closed the gates up behind and locked them. After we got settled in, Travis liked to go ahead and do a sweep of the quarry before it got too dark outside. I let him do it, and I went to go get things settled in the building. It was maybe 20 minutes later when Travis suddenly came running into the door. He was very flustered and winded. At first, I couldn't make out what was wrong with him. When he finally took the chance to breathe, he told me he'd just found a dead body out in the quarry. He said the person looked like they'd been killed very recently too. Travis was pretty freaked out, so I asked him where this body was. I told him to go ahead and call the police right now, then call our boss to let him know. I was going to go and check out this body for myself. By this point, it was definitely getting dark out. I took out my flashlight and began to head to the area where he said he'd found it at. When I got there, I began shining my flashlight all around. It was dark, but I noticed what he'd found pretty quickly. When I did, though, I also noticed there was a person crouched over the body. I only saw the person clearly for one moment, but he looked like he was going through the person's pockets. When my flashlight hit him, he took off pretty quickly out of the area. Yes, I was a security guard, but I had no idea what to do. I had a gun, but I wasn't allowed to just shoot the intruder, even if they might be a killer. I was not a cop, and I knew I could get into a lot of trouble for shooting at someone, whether the person was suspected of murder or not. I decided to chase after the figure. I hadn't got a look at the body, so I didn't know for sure how they'd been killed. I just hoped the figure I was chasing didn't have a weapon. If they didn't, that would be the best advantage I had. I ran in that direction and realized the person was gunning for the fence. He had a head start on me, and he was a bit faster than I was as well. He got to the fence and began climbing before I got there. By the time I got another glimpse of him, he'd already climbed to the very top. I shined my flashlight right in his face, and that seemed to catch him off guard. He almost fell off on the other side of the fence. He caught himself, however, and jumped off and ran into the night. I wasn't about to jump the gate and chase the guy that far, though. It was one thing for me to be patrolling within the fenced area where I worked, but this guy could have been long gone before I even got my ass over that fence. I went back to the gate at the road and waited for the police to arrive. It did take them quite a while to get there, and I was sure the guy I'd chased off was way far away at this point. I was able to give the police a pretty bad description of who I'd seen. I had a few glimpses, but they weren't very long. Travis, on the other hand, hadn't seen the possible killer at all. The scariest part for my brother, however, was that apparently the person had been killed right around the time he started his patrol. The police theorized that since the killer had come back to the body after my brother left, my brother must have gotten there right after the murder and scared the guy off. The man had been killed with a knife, so the killer might have been scared if he knew we had guns or something. Travis was quite shaken by what he was told, but he tried his best to brush it off. The experience has shaken us both enough that we couldn't keep working at that quarry. We didn't want to be there, just in case the guy decided to come back with others or something and finish the job. I grew up in a house way out in the middle of nowhere. I really didn't care for it too much, and I currently live in the city. Although, I guess for the most part, it's much more dangerous generally in the city, I like the area a lot more. The area I lived in back then was called Greasy Ridge, and it was in southern Ohio. Our house was all alone at the very top of a hill. My closest friends lived all the way down the hill, which would take about 20 minutes to walk down the road and get to their house. The school bus that would take us to school would take about an hour and 15 minutes to get us there. Although I wasn't really always happy living out in the country like that, the best thing about it compared to the city was that it seemed relatively safe. I mean, we left our doors unlocked all the time. It really wasn't something we normally even thought about. When I was 14 years old, my parents and my younger sister were going to visit family across the river in West Virginia. Normally, that meant that my cousin would be watching my sister while all the parents went out drinking. I mean, there was no telling when they would be getting back, so I decided to stay home instead. I figured I would just watch some TV or movies by myself. It was pretty late at night when I was sitting on the sofa watching television. Our living room faced the front of the house. We had a very big picture window facing the front of the house as well. Our driveway was also pretty long. It was probably getting close to 11 p.m. when I saw a car pull into our driveway and begin making its way up to our house. Now, I doubted this could be my parents. There was no way they would be coming back this early on a drinking night. Other than them, though, I had no idea who this could possibly be. When the car got closer, I was able to see it was some sort of pickup truck. Two big older men got out of it and began walking up to the door. I went and met them at the door, and they asked me if someone named Troy was at the house. I told them that no one with that name lived here. Almost immediately, the men began getting angry with me. They told me I was lying and that they knew Troy was home. How dare I lie to them and tell them Troy didn't live there? I was a 14-year-old country boy, so obviously I didn't like anyone speaking to me like that. I got angry and told them that no one with that name fucking lived here and to get the hell off my property or else. Even at age 14 though, I should have known that was a stupid thing to do. I hadn't opened the screen door of the house, and one of the guys began reaching for the handle. I then quickly shut the front door, locked it, and bolted it. The two guys pounded on the door and were demanding me to open it up for a few moments. I simply told them to go fuck themselves. Looking out the window, I saw them walk away from the door. They went walking back to their truck, and at first I expected them to get in and drive away. But they didn't. They grabbed some huge object from the bed of the truck and began walking back toward the house. I wasn't really scared, but I was somewhat concerned. These were big and scary-looking guys. I began closing the drapes on the picture window, but before I could get the drapes all the way closed, the big object came flying through. I only had a few moments to think, and I did as quickly as I could. I figured the two men were going to try and come in through the recently broken window, so I ran into my dad's room. My dad was really old school country. He kept his shotgun at all times in his bedroom, fully loaded. He taught me to use it from a really young age, so I knew I had that gun there to protect me. I grabbed the gun and ran back to the living room. The guys were both in there, and one of them had a baseball bat. I, of course, had a boomstick with me. "Where's Troy?" one of them asked, before seeing the gun in my hands. They both took a step back. "Get the fuck out of my house or I'll mount your head on my wall," I told them, leveling my gun at them. "You ain't gonna shoot," one of them began, before I pulled the trigger and fired right past his head as a warning. They both took my warning seriously and fled back through the window. Rather than going to the window myself, I went over to the front door and opened it. I went out on the porch. I was first worried that they might go and get a gun out of their truck too, but they didn't. They got into the truck and began pulling out. Being the so-called tough guys they probably considered themselves to be, they began screaming threats as they pulled out. Another shot from my shotgun at their car silenced their asses real quick though. I couldn't get in touch with my parents, and it took the police a while to get there. I gave them good descriptions. I knew both cops as well, since I went to school with their younger siblings. They found my story quite humorous actually, and I got some respect from them for doing what I did. The two guys were found, but they were just warned, not arrested. This was not really unusual for the area that we lived in though. They did have to pay to get the window replaced, and we were told if they didn't, they would let my dad deal with them any way he wanted to. Troy was some guy who lived out on the ridge, I found out. I never knew him though. These guys had gotten the wrong house. I, 30 and female, live in a relatively safe neighborhood, barring the occasional mugging attempts, one of which took place right against my bedroom window with one of my neighbors. There's also the few times a random guy in his car followed me to my place, asking for my phone number. Otherwise, things are generally stable though. I typically have a way of dealing with those assholes anyway, by taking advantage of this random empty lot on my street, where cars can't drive through, forcing them to go around the entire block. By the time they managed to turn around the corner and try to cut me off or whatever, I would already have run back into my house and disappeared. No biggie. A few months ago, some genius in our street paid someone in the city to move the neighborhood garbage disposer to another place, whereas before it was right down the block. Now it was a few minutes walk away. Now I have to walk a while before I can throw out my garbage, usually in quite a busy area as well, which I find somewhat embarrassing. I started waiting until nightfall to do so because of this. I know that's stupid with everything I told you just before, but I got sloppy and things started feeling safer in the last few months. Because of this, I felt very comfortable leaving my home after sundown, until last Sunday at least. Like usual, I waited until it was dark to go. After throwing the garbage out, I stopped by the convenience store nearby to pick up some things on my way back. As I was returning to my place, though, at the entrance of my street, I noticed a young man standing in front of a parking lot located in front of one of my neighbor's houses, right across the street from where I lived. He was talking on the phone and looking away from me. As I rounded the corner, though, I also noticed a guy sitting quietly on his motorbike right in front of my doorstep. There was something about the way he was already looking right at me, just as my eyes landed on him, that really freaked me out. I did some quick math and realized that by the time I would be able to open the door, if ever, this guy could easily catch me if he wanted to. This time, the empty lot trick was not going to work. I would have to walk past this guy anyway, but also his motorbike could just be driven into it easily. I turned on my heels and started to head back to the convenience store, hoping he was just a delivery guy waiting for someone or something. I dilly-dallied at the store for a while, but when I went back home, I found the man was still there waiting on his bike, while the guy in front of my neighbor's lot was still on his phone, or at least pretending to be, staring at me before I'd even seen him. I realized that something was not quite right here. Luckily, I noticed the security guard of the street was behind us, sitting right in his booth. I quickly approached him and explained the situation, hoping he'd at least walk me to my place, which he gladly did. The moment the guy on the phone saw me return with the security guard, he slipped his phone in his pocket and turned towards the guy on the bike. The guy on the bike then drove off with him. Keep in mind, these two had not ever looked at one another, let alone indicated they knew each other whatsoever. The guy who was on his phone sat behind the motorbike dude, and they shot past me while staring at me. Both the security guard and I agreed that something was funny about the situation. Thankfully, he waited with me until I was safely behind locked doors. I don't know if those two wanted to mug me or what, but I'm glad I trusted my gut and didn't just go home with those guys right there. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened. I go to college on one side of the city, although I live on the complete opposite side. Because of this, I have to use public transportation quite often. Mostly, this means I use the subway system. It's great actually, because I'm able to get around easily, and I really have no desire to live in the area that my campus is in anyway. I never have problems on the subway, and despite the reputation that subway systems get, they really are generally safe. The only scary thing that's ever happened to me on the subway happened during my junior year of college. I had a really important paper that was due, so after classes I would go down to the library for some peace and quiet. Before I knew it though, it was already after midnight. I had to head on home to get some sleep. Now, this was not the first time I ever rode the subway that late at night. I wasn't really worried about anything happening. It was common for a homeless person to ride the subways at night often, as a place to sleep or settle down for a bit. More than anything else though, those kind of people were fairly obvious. They were always laying down and sleeping while I was sitting on the train though, and didn't seem to pose much a bother to anyone, other than taking up some space. This time though, while I was sitting on the train, a man stepped through the far door from the other car. He was walking towards the end of the car that I was sitting at. He had a Bible in his hand, and seemed to be reading some verse from it very loudly. I don't really know enough about the Bible though to know what exactly he was quoting, but it was something about being born again. I didn't really think too much of it. It wasn't that unusual to see someone preaching on the subway. What was unusual though was when the guy stepped through the door to go into the next car. I turned around to make sure he was gone. Only I saw he was just standing at the window of the door, giving me the most sinister look I'd ever seen in my life. When I looked back, rather than avert his gaze, he just stood there and kept on glaring daggers at me. I was the one to break eye contact with him first. I just went back to reading my book and tried to ignore that unpleasant feeling. I didn't look back around, but somehow I could still feel his eyes on me. When I finally got to my stop, I hurried off the train. Much to my chagrin, though, he got out of the subway from a different car and immediately began following me. I tried to pretend that I didn't see this as I hurried to get out of the station. Once we were out, though, he still kept following me, turning down every street I turned down. I had never been that scared before in my entire life. Fortunately, though, I was able to get to my apartment building before he caught up with me. I opened the lobby door and hurried inside. I tried to close the door behind me quickly. However, before I could latch it, the man shoved his arm inside. I told the guy I knew he did not live there, and if he didn't leave me alone right now, I would call the cops. In what seemed like a very sincere voice, the man told me that all he wanted to do was make sure I had been saved. I responded that I was an atheist, and I just wanted to be left alone. "An atheist," he responded in a condescending voice. "You know you'll be going to hell when you die, right?" I told him I didn't believe in hell, and I wasn't scared of going somewhere that didn't exist. At that moment, the man reached into his jacket with his other hand and pulled out a blade. "I bet you're scared right now," he said to me. "I bet you're scared that I'm gonna send you straight to hell." He struggled with the door, trying to get it open, or at least get his hand with the knife through. He wasn't able to open it any further, though. I wasn't able to completely fend him off either, though, so we were kind of stuck in a dangerous stalemate. What the hell is going on here? I heard someone call out from behind me. For a moment, I was startled, but one of my downstairs neighbors had come out into the lobby. He must have heard the commotion. "I've called the police, so if I was you, I'd get the hell out of here," he said to the homeless man. The homeless man stopped struggling, although he didn't immediately take his arm out of the door. After a moment, he thrust the blade back into his pocket and pulled his arm out of the doorway. He then took off running down the street. I thanked my neighbor, who revealed he actually hadn't had any time to call the cops at all. I didn't care, though, as the bluff worked well. When I was a senior in college, I didn't have my own car. I really hated public transportation, but I got to ride free since I was a college student. Because of this, I often used it. Even so, crowded areas tend to really freak me out, so if I got out of class earlier in the day, I almost always waited until after rush hour to ride the bus home. I wasn't always able to do this, however. This one particular afternoon, I had to get home early. Honestly, though, because of what happened at the bus stop, I can't even really remember what I had to get home early for. I was waiting for the bus, but when it pulled up, it was so crowded there was no way I could have gotten into it and been comfortable at all. A few others tried to squeeze their way on, but the majority of us at the stop didn't want to do that. It was rush hour, and there would be another bus coming by soon, certainly. If you ride public buses, you probably know that the bus isn't supposed to be in motion if anyone was standing in front of a line at the front. Well, there were several people packed into this area. The driver wasn't closing the doors. He demanded that some people get off the bus, so he could finally take off and leave. It wasn't happening, though. Nobody wanted to get off. I was worried about this because I saw the second bus was coming up soon. It may have appeared to the driver of the second bus that we were all still boarding, so we only stopped for a moment. Almost immediately, the second bus driver started back up and moved to go around the first bus. The lady beside me got tired of waiting, I guess. I assumed she went to walk to the subway station instead, so she started walking across the street in front of the bus stop. The very moment she stepped past that parked bus, though, the woman was hit by the second bus that was just passing the first. It was such a shocking moment. I could literally feel the woman's blood splattering all over me. The shock of what I was seeing and what I was feeling was overwhelming. I feel bad even saying that, though, because I wasn't the person who got hit. No matter how scary it was for me, it must have been a million times worse for her. The hit knocked the woman forward, and I watched in what seemed like slow motion as she slammed on the ground, then rolled over and over on the asphalt. I can't even describe how horrible it looked. I figure you probably don't want that description either. I immediately ran over to her to check if she was still alive. Despite how horrific she looked, thankfully she was. The bus driver stopped and got out pretty quickly. I was pushed behind a bunch of people who started tending to her. Fortunately for the woman, the bus had not been going at full speed, so she did survive the hit. For the longest time though, I always imagined her blood splattering over me every time I saw a bus coming down the road. It was a horrifying experience. I was taking the train home after a long day at work. Usually the trains are pretty crowded. I work a late second shift, however, so it was often nearly empty by the time I was going home. When I got on the train at my stop this day, I was able to find a car that was completely empty. I was grateful because I'd have a place to sit down and read until my stop in peace. A stop or two later, though, another man climbed on board the train in my car. He went to the far side and sat down. Although I was happy he was sitting further away from me, I wasn't too happy that he sat down in a seat directly facing me. I became even less happy when I noticed he was just blatantly staring at me. As the train went on from start to finish, my ride home took approximately an hour or so. I was not looking forward to just sitting there with this weirdo looking at me the whole time. If you've ever been in a situation like this, you would know exactly how that feels. I didn't want to get up and move though, because I was afraid he would just get up and follow me. That would confirm that he was a creep. I tried to just read my book for a while, but it was really hard to concentrate with how intensely he was staring at me. I eventually looked up from my book when I saw that the guy had been moving around for a bit apparently. I looked up just in time to see him pull a rubber mask over his face. When he put his hands down, I noticed it was a leather face mask. You know, like the killer from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I was startled, but I tried not to let it show. I just looked back down at my book and tried to ignore him. I could see the guy if I only looked up a bit, so as long as I could take notice of him out of the corner of my eye, I would know if he was trying to do anything else. I told myself he was probably just some jackass trying to creep people out on the train, wanted to give me a little scare. I can't explain how creepy it was though, that he just sat there in silence for the rest of the ride, just looking at me through the eye holes of the rubber mask. Each time I raised my eyes just a little, I would confirm that he was still staring at me. My stop just couldn't come quickly enough. When it was getting closer finally, I got out of my chair and hurried over to the exit. While I was standing there, as the train slowed down, I saw the guy get up and begin walking in my direction, still wearing that mask. I groaned, realizing he had more than enough time to get to the door and get off at my same stop. He was slowly walking toward the door, not in any great hurry it seemed. I just knew he was going to get off the train with me and try to follow me after. Do who knows what after that. I mean, maybe he was still just a jerk trying to scare me, but maybe he was a jerk who wanted to do more than just a scare. As the stop came, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. When I looked back into the car, I saw a conductor walking up to the man from behind. As the train came to a stop, the masked man turned around and took a swing at the conductor. As he did so, I saw two other conductors rush into the car behind them. The train stopped and the door shot open. I hurried off the train as quickly as I could. I was just one guy. I was sure these three conductors could handle the creep. I made sure he was not trying to follow me off and got away from that train station as quickly as I could. I have no idea what happened after. My wife and I have one daughter together. I'm a professional writer, so I work from home. My wife is a project manager though, so she's gone throughout the day. This is pretty important to know for the dynamics of this story. This story happened on a bright spring day. My wife was already at work, and I wanted to get some lawn work done before I had to go to work myself. My daughter hated the noise of the lawnmower, so I put some cartoons on the TV for her while I went out to mow the lawn. There are only 2 doors to the house. One is in the front where I began mowing. The other entrance is in the back of the house from the kitchen. We never used that back door, except to sometimes take the garbage out. Usually it was kept chained and locked. Our living room had a huge picture window in it, so I was able to see inside to check on my daughter while I was pushing the lawnmower around. It got hot pretty quickly outside, and we all know that pushing a lawnmower in the hot sun can really take its toll on you. We had a decently big lawn as well, so I was starting to get a bit tired and thirsty. I thought I would take a break from mowing and turned it off. I then glanced over at the picture window to check on my daughter. Needless to say, I was shocked when I saw a huge man now standing in the window, looking right at me. He grabbed the drapes and pulled them closed. I was terrified for my daughter's safety. I immediately sprinted towards the house. I assumed whoever the guy was, he must have locked me out of the house already. The front door opened immediately, although the drapes on it were closed. When I got inside, the living room was empty. Neither my daughter nor the guy I saw were in there. I assumed they must have run out the back door. I sprinted into the kitchen, only to find the kitchen door was chained and locked as usual. Perplexed, I paused for a moment. I couldn't figure out for the life of me. Then I felt something touch my hand. I jumped up. It was my daughter. She asked me if I was done mowing the lawn already. I asked her in a panic where the man who had closed the drapes was. She was pretty confused and said she hadn't seen any man. She had in fact just gotten up to go to the bathroom a few minutes ago. Luckily, my daughter was okay and seemed to have missed the man. I called the police, who searched my house. They found nothing wrong with the back door, the chain, or the lock. The only way the man could have gotten both into and out of the house was through the front door. The police assumed he must have hidden from me while I was mowing the lawn, then snuck in while I wasn't looking. Then, when I went inside, he must have hidden from me and went out the front door while I burst into the kitchen in a panic. Now, I guess that's possible, but I'm not sure how to answer the question of how he got inside when I was in the front yard the entire time. Certainly a mystery to be sure. I'm a really clean person. Although I take a shower every day and occasionally even twice a day, I really can't stand being wet. The absolute only way I can deal with the unpleasant feeling of being insulted with water is by keeping the water as hot as possible. I live alone in a really old house with a really old water heater. Because of this, the hot water doesn't always last as long as I'd like it to. The most disturbing thing that's ever happened to me happened a few years ago during a week in the winter. I was at work and we got hit by a snowstorm. Before leaving work, I had to shovel over a foot of snow off of, out from under, and from in front of my car. I was pretty sweaty because of this, an extremely gross feeling by that point. I was just dying to take a shower when I got home. I went over to the shower, and my hot water only lasted for a few moments. It was a pain in the ass, because when I felt it getting cold, I knew I had to wash up as quickly as possible and get out of there. The water was just way too cold. It wasn't completely unusual for this to happen sometimes, so I really didn't think that much about it. It was just an unlucky day for me. Unfortunately for me, the unluckiness continued throughout the week. The snow just kept coming and coming, and every day when I got home, I had to take a shower. My hot water would only last for a couple of minutes at most. I had to face the fact that the heater was probably getting too old to function properly, and I might have to replace it soon. I'm slightly handy myself, so I looked up some website information on water heaters. I decided to check the heater out myself on the weekend. I have one of those basements that's more like a cellar. It's only accessible from the outside, and the walls are all cinder blocks. The crawl space for the house is not completely blocked off either. After finding all the information I needed, I grabbed up some tools and went down to the basement. I really hated the lighting down there because it was only one single light bulb hanging down from the ceiling with a chain to turn it on. I had to walk down the stairs in the dark and fumble my way over to that single light. I pulled the chain to turn it on, and I screamed the moment the light turned on. I was looking directly at a man lying in the crawl space, staring at me. Terrified as anyone would have been, I ran back up the stairs as quickly as possible. I locked the door from the outside and headed to the house to call the police. It turned out the man had been living in my crawl space all winter. He had food and blankets and all sorts of things down there. I shuddered to think how much longer he would have been down there without me even knowing, had my water heater not spontaneously stopped working. I'm a bit up there in years, and I don't have any children of my own, so I don't know if this is still something parents do. If they do, I think they should be shot. My parents were not great parents, and whenever they didn't have the patience to deal with me, they would always scare me. They told me if I didn't behave or do my chores or basically anything that even slightly annoyed them, like going to bed on time, that the boogeyman would sneak into my bedroom while I was sleeping and drag me off to hell. Of course, when you're that young, it's easy to believe those sorts of things. That just makes it all the more terrifying. Whenever my parents brought up the boogeyman, I just knew I couldn't risk it. I quieted down a lot. That was probably my biggest mistake, because it just made them more likely to continue this in the future. Around the time I was 10 years old, I'd begun to hear noises coming from my closet at night. The first time it happened, I ran and told my parents that the boogeyman was in my closet. All they did was tell me I needed to go back to bed, where he would come out of the closet and drag me to hell that very night. I went back to bed, although it was a long time before I actually went to sleep. The following night, I heard the noises again. This time, I was determined not to go running to my parents. I really was convinced the boogeyman was in my closet, and I didn't want him to drag me to hell. When I heard a loud noise in the closet of things falling down, though, I left my bed and dashed towards my parents' room. The end result was the same as it had been the night before, so I stopped going to tell my parents about the noises, even though I heard them every single night. Each night I couldn't sleep until the noises stopped. Since I wasn't bothering my parents anymore, they just thought I was being well behaved. They allowed me to have a sleepover, and I invited my best friend Brent. I told him what had been going on. He thought it was all in my head, but he was willing to stay up and listen for me. Sure enough, that night, Brendan was in his sleeping bag when we both began hearing noises again. Brent nearly peed himself as we both ran out of the room. He confirmed to my parents that something really was going on in there. My dad finally decided to check it out. When he came to the room, he heard the noises in the closet too, only they weren't really coming from the closet. When he opened the door, nothing was there. The noises had been coming from the closet ceiling, which was right under our attic. For all his faults, my dad was a pretty tough guy who didn't mess around. He was also a hunter. He went and grabbed his shotgun rather than calling the police. He said it might just be an animal, and he wanted to be sure first. He made Brent and I go wait with my mom. While we waited downstairs in the living room, we heard one shot go off from the shotgun. This time, even my mom was afraid. After a few moments, we heard noises on the steps of the house coming down from the attic, then from the second floor. We froze, completely scared of what might be coming down the stairs. We saw first a man we had never seen before. It frightened us for sure. Then we saw, though, that his hands were tied up, and my dad was right behind him with the barrel of the shotgun at his back. He held him there while my mom called the cops. It turned out that this man had broken into our attic a month before and was living there. The shot we heard was my dad firing a warning shot. It also blew a hole in the ceiling that he had to fix up later. I often wonder, though, if my parents had never used this boogeyman nonsense to scare me, how much sooner would they have caught this guy?